So I finally finished the last 4 chapters of this book, and as a result, I've now finished the book. And usually I would review, like with these longer kind of reflections on these kinds of books, I would review them, say like chunk by chunk. And I should be reviewing these last 4 chapters, but to be honest, this book repeats itself quite a bit. So I'm just going to talk about the book in general. One thing to go right off the bat to get out of the way is that this book is actually a philosophy/history of debt. And the author has a very obvious bias when it comes to the nature of debt. And he has some points that are defensible, that can be defended. They're fair points to make. I think a lot of people do have too much of a finance outlook on the nature of debt and not enough of a political outlook on the nature of debt. Like, for example, he talks about how giving debt instruments to like middle class or lower class people was actually a bad thing because it functioned as a kind of enslavement. Whereas when rich people take on debt, or nobles, kings, financiers, they can pay off their debts, and it's usually a tool. And not to mention, he talks about how historically the interest rates between the elites was much lower than the interest rates between the elites and the lower classes. There was no exhaustive substantiation of that kind of point, but he pointed out that it did at least happen a few times. Another interesting thing that goes on in this book, which is like almost a presupposition in the book, is that he keeps talking about how money shapes the thinking of different time periods, which is presupposing that the material conditions of society shape the way people think. He does that sometimes, right? For example, he talks about how the notion of debt or the notion of coinage or the notion of quantifying human relationships was invented by having debts and currencies and obligations to one another. And that then led to things like, for example, he talks about in the Abrahamic religions, there's these ideas about like exchange, that you could never be equal to God. For example, you can't exchange, your value can never be exchanged for God. There's lots of different cultural landmarks he talks about that use the language of exchange, which he says is a byproduct of quantifying human relationships, right? Talking about, oh, you owe me this many dollars, or you owe me this many coins. He makes that point a lot. So that's presupposing that the material conditions shape the way humans think. He does this in this book. And he also does something on the other hand, which is kind of contrary to that kind of presupposition, which is that he seems to presuppose there are innate ideas within human existence that have been expressed at different times throughout history. And he does this a lot towards the end of the book with the axial age versus non-axial age or post-axial age. Maybe an example of this might be like the idea of causation. Humans have always had the idea of causation, but how it is expressed changes based on the time period. Well, he does this with debt. So one of the examples could be like he calls it the tried and true model of building up a bunch of debt to fund a really massive army, to then pillage another nation to pay off the debts for those armies. And that's like a repeating cycle. And he says that the US did this, the US military did this, and he actually did provide one interesting graph that showed the overall government expenditure with the overall military budget for the US government. And they were pretty much hand in hand, that's the first graph that I saw in the book. And I was like, wow, that's persuasive. That's a solid point. Overall, I would say this book is like a 7 out of 10. It's very obviously biased, and the book isn't super organized. A lot of, I would probably say 33% of what is written in here could be taken out because it's either repeating itself or it's going on like a philosophical tangent that isn't related to the thesis of the book. I didn't really get the impression, like when he starts off in the beginning of the book, I got this impression that he was about to throw some haymakers about the nature of debt. Instead, we just get his personal opinions on some events that involve debt. We don't really get like an exhaustive, robust point made about the nature of debt, which is a bit of a downfall. So I would say the book is a bit overhyped, and it's written well, and I would still recommend reading it if you're interested in debt. But if you're interested in an actual history of debt, this is not it. You're better off looking somewhere else. I'm going to look somewhere else because I would like the history of debt. There is a book out there called The History of Credit Instruments, or is it The History of Derivatives? I don't know. I'm going to check that out and I'll let you know. But yeah, overall, this is a 7 out of 10. It's a bit more hyped than it is actually good. But with that being said, guys, bye-bye for now.